was launched at the Hague Appeal for Peace in 1999, just before the entrance of 2000, when we had hope for the world, by Betty Reardon, peace educator and author, and Cora Weiss, who at the time was president of the International Peace Bureau. Tony also, like Betty, cooperates with UNESCO, including on consultation on the new recommendation on education for peace, human rights, and sustainable development. Tony, I find it wonderful that you were able to come and even stay for the whole period. And we look forward to listening to you today and to participate in your workshop on Sunday. And I feel fully confident that you will help us face the enormous challenge of learning to live together in these times. Floor is yours, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you. There you go. Yeah, thank you for the warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have some connection to Norway. I'm very proud to say that I'm a PhD graduate from NTNU. So I have a nice connection here, and it's wonderful to be back. I'm really happy to hear some of the early remarks, this story about the bells being a global language of peace. I have friends in Japan who have an organization, they're English language teachers. They have an organization called Peace is a Global Language. I think it's a fantastic concept. I don't know that we're fully fluent in that yet. We have to work on it. So we have some tools that we're going to use this weekend. So as mentioned, this is a bit of an experiment here. So if my English is difficult to follow, hopefully this AI over here will help you follow along in Norwegian. We can experiment with this. Let us know how it works as we move along. Language can be a tricky thing. We need to have common language to communicate, to understand each other. And I have a funny story about this from just a few moments ago. I came out to the hallway to look on the schedule of events, and it says that Tony is giving, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, a kasari? Kasari? Kasari, thank you. So this, I don't know this word, so, obviously I can't speak the language very well. So eventually I looked it up, and it was shared with me what it is. It's informal, entertaining, conversational style talk, maybe humorous, maybe a bit of irony. Okay, that's what the definition is, as I understand it. A powerful, wonderful, uniquely Scandinavian term. Okay, so I bring my phone out of my pocket before I knew what this was as the definition. And I was using Google Translate on my camera to understand what this word was. And the first thing it did is it translated the word to quote by Tony Jenkins. And then, wait a minute, it changed. And the next word it changed to was crap by Tony Jenkins. Oh, wait. Then it changed again. And the third word was cursed by Tony Jenkins. So tonight, I'm proud to say that you're going to get some cursed crap quoted by Tony Jenkins for your entertainment. That takes the pressure off, right? Doesn't it? So I want to also suggest, as I do often in the different spaces that I try to facilitate, that we find some other universal signals. We can use some body language to help us in these spaces to communicate some basic things. So in this room in particular, I want to propose some sign language that we can all use. So the first sign language I want to introduce is if we're having trouble hearing somebody, I want us all to practice this. Let's do this. Make it really, really obvious. Okay. So let's use this throughout the weekend if you can't hear someone. Rather than disrupting and shouting, let's do, okay. The second one, and I think this is important in places where different languages are used, we need a signal to slow down. So I'm going to suggest you do this. Yeah? If I'm speaking too fast, I'm going to get excited. Do this. Slow down. Okay? And then I think one more, when we're using technology like this, if someone gets too far away from the microphone, we can do this one. Yeah? All right. So, those will be our 3 sign languages. We can add to them, but please experiment with me as we go along today. All right, so as Ingeborg has mentioned, I've come here straight from Granada, where we were hosting the International Institute on Peace Education with several partner universities from across Spain. And this gathering in Granada was the 46th gathering of the Institute, going back to 1982, over those 44 years. In that time period, we have traveled what we begin to describe ourselves as a movable feast of peace educators. We've been in 25 different countries. I like to think of the experience I just had there was a gathering of hope. And I think that's really important for us. And that hope comes from an intention we set. When we're in a space like that, there's some certain aspects of what we do that are quite traditional. We do a lot of work of analyzing systems, structures, and institutions of violence. We think about challenges that we face, both personally and politically in the world. But we engage in those kind of questions, we do so from a prefigurative lens. And what I mean by that is we're actually seeking to model the world that we want to live in through the way in which we're designing our learning in those spaces. All right, so we have a model of praxis, of reflection and action that we're trying to do. We bookended our week at the Institute in Granada, so at the beginning of the week and then later at the end, by talking about the global context that we're living in, right? This has become a world and a time that we've stepped into that we've often been describing as living in a polycrisis. You're familiar with this term, right? So, we are living at this convergence of multiple existential threats that I know we'll be talking about this weekend, but the likes of which we've never experienced before. This can be an overwhelming challenge. In the context of our institute, we try not to let it deter us, because it easily can, and this is something I want to talk a little bit about tonight. So we try to see it as a challenge that can be overcome by us working and learning together. So this polycrisis, which I'll talk just a little bit about, is obviously rooted in a lot of terrible negative trends in interstate conflict, intrastate conflict. We also have these converging crises that are somewhat unconventional, climate threat, climate change, resource scarcity, migration, the influence of AI, all these other things. And these threats together obviously present a tremendous challenge for us working for peace, right? It's quite overwhelming. And obviously our task goes beyond, as we all know, just simply reducing the various forms and manifestations of direct violence that we encounter in the world. It's more than that. I was reading on the plane here a wonderful quote from former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And I think he was really wise in stating that we know peace cannot be decreed slowly through treaties. It must be nurtured through dignity, rights, and capacities of every man and woman. But I think even that's not enough, right? If we don't find also a way to reconnect with the earth. And I know that's part of the mission of this academy. So this pursuit of peace within the polycrisis that we're living through right now needs to be holistic. It needs to be comprehensive, right? So we need to be working on structural levels, right? On political levels. We need to work to design and develop and hold accountable institutions and infrastructures to support intervention and prevention. We need the mechanisms and appeals of common security and diplomacy and international law, all those things that we will talk about this weekend. But at the same time, we also know that peace is rooted in more than that. It's not just about institutions, right? It's rooted in norms and ethics and principles. We need democratic participation, right? We need the presence of justice and dignity and human rights and empathy, right? All of these things that we need to be able to have human flourishing and human well-being, right? We have the evidence and the research that backs us up, you know? So within this mix, I'm talking about education. Obviously, education, I think, plays a very important role in not just preventing violence, but also transforming violence, and most importantly, nurturing and sustaining cultures of peace. So education for peace does have a long history as a tool, as a framework for us, but I think it still remains really in the shadows, all right? So Ingeborg just mentioned the 2023 recommendation on education for peace, human rights, and sustainable development. And I think it's a remarkable document that gives us some hope, especially as it was adopted by all 194 member states of UNESCO. It's a tool that we can hold our member states accountable to. But I think, even having this global standard-setting normative instrument at our disposal, that peace education still continues to be politicized. It's still at the margins, and it still is delegitimized at every turn, by those who are seeking to maintain power, privilege in the world, right? And so we have to think about that. How do we uplift the possibilities of transforming education for peace? And I think what we see happening with those who are in power, the political elites and others who are making the decisions about what our education looks like, is they've made an intentional choice to favor the adoption of education that drives separation. All right. So they advocate for a curricula or a pedagogy that supports learning to live apart rather than learning to live together. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about tonight. So I'm hoping to borrow from some of the tools and the frameworks here and a little bit of a spark of imagination from Johan Galtung. I want to provide for you a bit of a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a recommended educational therapy for this polycrisis. That's my hope tonight. I think probably most of you already have a good awareness, a consciousness of the diagnosis. It's pretty obvious. We can see it with our own eyes. We experience it on a day-to-day basis in the world that we're living in today. The prognosis, where it may lead us, well, I'm really hopeful still that we can change the course. The future isn't set, but we're moving in the wrong direction. And the therapy leading us to a future which is yet to be written, that's the most difficult task. So I'm going to spend as much time as I can addressing that. So I hope to provide some clarity, or maybe a little bit more confusion, to what the future can be by attempting to articulate how learning to live together can work as a framework for peace education, a very foundational framework for peace education. But more than that, but also a framework for peace action, which I know many of you are engaged in, and a therapy that might help us heal the fractured world that we're living in today. So a couple of quick disclaimers. I'm going to say a couple words and concepts here that I want to throw out there and be clear with before I begin. First and foremost, I want to be clear that what I'm saying and offering here today is coming from my perspective, my experience, my context of course, living in the United States in this challenging time, but also reflecting my experiences working in various international communities. So these perspectives are mine alone. I'm not trying to provide some sort of universal prescriptive solution to the problems that we're living in today. That's a challenge for us all to think a little bit about how we adapt some of the ideas I'm sharing to your own context. I also want to clarify that when I'm talking about education, I'm talking about not just what happens in classrooms and formal schooling, the schooling of the state. I don't want to limit it to that. When I talk about education, I'm talking about learning that happens and takes place both inside and outside the classroom, across the lifespan, and is continuous and ongoing endeavor, right? So I'm gonna bring probably more of an emphasis to learning than schooling per se. So when I'm talking about education, know that I'm holding this big container as I'm describing it. And then finally, this is where language comes in, is rather interesting. I discovered today that words like student and pupil mean different things in the Norwegian context. So I'm going to use those words, student, pupil, and learner, somewhat interchangeably as I'm talking tonight. And in my context and the way I think, they're all sort of the same thing. I still think of myself as a student. I still think of myself as a pupil. I think of myself as a learner, constantly learning. I'm in the act of constantly learning. And so I hope you consider yourself a learner, a student, and a pupil too. So I want to start in thinking about and framing and articulating this idea of learning to live together. I want to kind of frame it as a multi-dimensional and a really holistic task. It entails more than simply working on social relationships. I think when we see the terms, the words there, for many of us, that seems to imply that the focus here is on the interpersonal, right? And I think it's much more than that. Obviously, learning to live together, we need to prepare students with skills to manage conflicts, with skills of communication, with skills of listening. Yeah, I'll slide over here so you can see.
Should we put the radio mic on you now? Because
so I can float around? Oh, I can really move around now. Okay.
if you put that in a pocket,
Sure.
I can place it on your head. Is that all right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Let me move this.
Try that.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so free. This is so nice. All right. So what I'm trying to say is, when we think about learning to live together, I think we can be narrow. We can be too narrow about it. For many people, it implies that it's an interpersonal thing primarily, but I want to expand our thinking about that to broader context. We do need to do important things, like foster students' capacities for communication, conflict management skills, conflict resolution skills. Those things are important, but I don't want us to fixate when we think about peace education that the individual is the locus of the problem. All right? This is an orientation that I think of peace education that becomes too individual-centered. Right? We need to think about peace education as also playing a role in helping to transform cultures, structures, and institutions that give rise to and sustain attitudes, behaviors, and cultures of violence. There's a symbiotic relationship there, right? So I want us to think about that and expand our notions about what learning to live together means. So with this in mind, I want to kind of begin us with a relational conception of peace, one that I've been using a lot over the last 10 or 15 years in particular. And some of you might be familiar with this. This is a definition that comes from the Earth Charter. Are people familiar with the Earth Charter in the room? Only one hand in the back. 2 hands, maybe 3. This to me is such an important document. Probably more important and I think more clear in the way it conceptualizes peace and sustainable development than most of the UN frameworks for that matter. The Earth Charter was derived through global consensus, right? And it's a statement of values and principles for a sustainable future. So this was drafted back following the 1992 Earth Summit. And the definition that they work with is this one, is that peace is the wholeness created by right relationships with oneself, other persons, other cultures, other life, earth, and the larger whole of which all are a part. And I think you can see the relationality in this definition, in this conception here. And I think this is a really strong complement to Galtung's conception of positive peace, which obviously opposes, structures and cultures of violence. When I look at this definition, I think of it as a pedagogical tool. All right? I think it intentionally invites inquiry in the way in which it is phrased and structured. All right, so this idea of right relationships, I'm not sure if this translated accurately or not to Norwegian. This idea of right relationships is undefined, it's not clear just from reading that statement. So what it does to me is it requires students, learners, us to examine things like our own epistemologies, our own beliefs, our own values, and our own attitudes towards ourself, towards other persons, other life, the earth, and the larger whole, of which all are part. So there's sort of an ethical inquiry that's part of this, right? And this is an ongoing and a very active and lifelong sort of inquiry. And that can be reflective of diverse traditions and wisdoms that we need to contemplate. But I think if we think of it as an inquiry, it also becomes a really active and dynamic conception of what peace can be, right? Reflection and inquiry are ongoing processes about how do we go about contributing in a way to making peace a way of life rather than some end goal that we're trying to find, right? So this active nature of it too, I think, is really powerful. I think everyone in the room knows that maintaining right relationships, however we understand that to be, takes a lot of work. Anyone who is a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, a colleague, you know you have to work at it, but you somehow manage, right? So we all have kind of an awareness of what that looks like. And there's something else in this there's a couple other things in this I also really, really like. It's a definition of peace that allows for conflict and differences to exist. Right? That's part of the human condition. Right? Conflict is a natural part of the order of things. So even if we disagree on things, we're in conflict, we can still be in right relationship, right? We can still treat each other with dignity and respect, regardless of how we see things differently. And I think the last thing I want to tease out of this before I kind of move forward a little bit is this notion of wholeness. And I think that's really integral to this as well, right? This idea of wholeness makes clear the deep interdependence between us as a human, between persons, cultures, life, the earth, and different societies. And I think, well, maybe it's not absolutely explicit here. I believe this definition also addresses our relationship to those social, economic, and political systems and institutions that we envision and we design to manage conflict and assure justice. So there is some wonderful complementary research coming out of my old university, at Columbia University. There is a new think tank called the Sustaining Peace Project, and they have done some research that complements the ideas that I'm trying to unpack here. So they've been doing various transdisciplinary research to try to understand what are the foundations of stable, peaceful societies in the world. What are the foundations of peace systems? So they went around researching and looking for peace cultures and systems and structures and try to see what would work. And what they discovered is really shockingly simple. It's a concept that we all know. And what they decided was at the heart of peaceful societies is simply the presence of the ethic of positive reciprocity. The ethic of positive reciprocity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So in their own words here, they say that the central dynamic of sustainable peace systems are reciprocal interactions, and the degree to which more positive interactions outweigh more negative interactions. That seems like it's obvious, right? Right? But what they're saying here is the more positive reciprocity and the less negative reciprocity that exists between members of different groups, the more sustainable the peace. And so we can find ways, what they've observed is we can find ways in which different societies and cultures have been intentional about this. So they come up with a really interesting list of a range of things, including amongst them, they see the presence of cultural values that foster group belonging. They see some elements of a shared sense of social identity as something that contributes to that stability. They see a sense of interconnection and interdependence. We can find ways to structure those things, right? Complementing these sort of cultural values and structures are different norms for managing differences in conflict without violence. So that's one of the other things they see. And so in other words, what we really see in peace cultures, in sustainable peace cultures, is that they find ways to develop systems that help to acculturalize and institutionalize the relational values of peace. It's a really powerful and simple way. And it seems simple enough, but of course, we live in this world, right, in which negative reciprocity prevails. Our systems and institutions of justice, our systems and institutions for managing conflict and violence, from the local to the global, all have at their heart these notions of negative reciprocity that drive the logic behind them. So we need a bit of a diagnosis. This is where I want to go next. We need a diagnosis of the polycrisis that's shaping our present system if we're going to develop a proper inoculation, all right? And there's many symptoms we can unpack here. I want to just kind of focus in on a few. I want to focus in on a few that I think contribute to a kind of a separation sickness is the way I've been thinking of it as I prepared my thoughts for today. And I'm going to focus on those elements that shape our thinking, our ways of being, and our attitudes towards peace. Because these are things that we can particularly address through education. All right, so here's my diagnosis and prognosis, which is rooted in trying to understand the systems and cultures of negative reciprocity. So I'm just going to talk about these three as a kind of really anchoring our mindset in negative reciprocity. So we'll talk a lot about war and militarism, I think, this weekend, right? So we have obviously a very strong prevailing mindset of negative reciprocity that governs international peace and security efforts, right? So I don't think I need to spend time unpacking that, but we know, of course, peace pursued through strength is supported by policies and practices that really drive separation, isolation, dehumanization. All right, this sort of ethos, this way of thinking is rooted in the philosophies and thinking of political realism, which finds rationalizations and false assumptions about human nature, who we are as a species. And these ways of thinking open the door for the justifications of using coercion, control, deadly militarized force as a way to control, right, and to get the outcomes that we want. And what we know, of course, very clearly in this room is that war, at very best, might produce a very dubious, unsustainable, negative peace. But in the process of using war as a tool of making peace, the irony of that, it's not lost in this room. We end up adding new layers of structural and cultural violence, right? So there's this long precedent of this type of thinking, going back to biblical times, biblical narratives, mythology, bias research, that sustained a lot of false assumptions about human nature. Politicians, I know, love, at least in the United States, we love to claim that violence is part of who we are as a species. And this argument, which I think we can easily challenge, is a very convenient path to a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If violence is part of who we are, then nothing can be done about it, so why should we bother, right? But we know that these claims that humans are innately violent is untrue, right? In 1986, probably many of you are familiar with this, there were a group of scholars who gathered in Seville, Spain, coming from different scientific backgrounds who sought to challenge this notion. And specifically, they wanted to refute the notion that organized human violence is biologically determined. And they produced together the Seville Statement on Violence that determined quite the opposite, that it is scientifically incorrect to say that war is caused by instinct, right? Coincidentally, one of the leaders of that effort, David Adams, some of you might know of him. I had the pleasure of being with him last week in Granada, Spain. So his research and activism from that work has become the backbone of a lot of the culture of peace work that we see being pursued within the United Nations system, UNESCO, and also now by global civil society. But what we really see here when we look at human nature is the prevailing scientific consensus is very different. It's that violence and aggression in the human community depends very little on genetics. It depends much more on long chains of interactions between genetics and social learning. In other words, what we see is that violence is not something that's absolutely biologically determined, rather it's nurtured. And if indeed that violence is nurtured, it's learned. And then education then can play a role in helping to illuminate another path, right? I'm often quite fond of citing the sociologist Margaret Mead, who observed that if a people have an idea of going to war, the idea of war is the way in which certain situations defined within their society are to be handled, and they will sometimes go to war. So the influence of this war thinking is obvious in the militarization of our societies, of our world. But this thinking, in and of itself, it's a big part of our attention and the conversations we're having this weekend, but it's only one part of the problem. And it's in this way, these ways of thinking are influenced and are interdependent and intertwined with multiple other ways of, and systems of thinking and epistemologies that foster separation. And so I want to also unpack the notion of neoliberalism and how it shapes our world. So we need to talk about, if we're going to talk about this as a relational paradigm, we need to talk about economic relations that exist in our world. A little sip of water. Thank you. So with neoliberalism, as many of us would know, the state is active, obviously, in structuring the economy through the logic of free market activity. It centers competition and consumption as organizing principles for political and social life. Thank you. And it measures things like progress and growth through gross domestic product, which is a very poor indicator of the health and prosperity of a society. So probably many of you are familiar with Vandana Shiva. She argues that the assumption held by those who determine GDP is that if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. That's really strange logic to me, right? So things like subsistence farming, living sustainably, living relationally with the earth, as opposed to imposing our will upon the earth, right? Those things are not counted in the measurement of an economy, right? All right, and this is important because it's only those things and those activities that count in the economy that see social benefits, right? So we want to address that. One of my students, as we were discussing some of these ideas in Vandana Shiva's work, said to me, if our frameworks for measuring progress, such as GDP, are themselves instruments of exclusion, what would genuinely alternative systems of evaluation look like? So I'm a little bit worried. Even some of our wonderful frameworks that we use, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, incorporate some of this logic, right? So Sustainable Development Goal 8.0, which is focused on sustainable economic growth, it sets a target solution of 7% annual GDP growth for the least developed countries of the world. To me, that is not a guarantee of sustainable growth. More isn't always better if it doesn't consider overall well-being, if it doesn't think about equitable income distribution, if it doesn't think about environmental impacts of that growth, or if it doesn't think about other social factors, right? So there's something else about neoliberalism, and this is where it gets to the deep thinking that I think we need to overcome. It's driven by a certain take on individualism, right? It shapes assumptions, in particular for many people in the world, that a good life is determined by what one owns or possesses. We know, of course, that wealth doesn't bring happiness, but many people still find deep meaning in its pursuit, right? So in a consumerist neoliberal economy, most hold on to this view that a good life is determined by having more. So if we dive more deeply into that, into the logic behind that, look at the philosophy behind it. I want to challenge my philosopher colleague Dale Snauert, whom I was with in Spain last week, who talks more deeply about this. He reminds us that we have two sort of fundamental verbs in most languages, to have and to be, right? So these verbs sort of represent two polar dispositions that we can take to how we interact with the world. We can be, I am what I have, or I am what I am. So our current economic arrangements encourage that I am what I have sort of orientation, right? And if I am what I have, and what I have can be taken away, I end up living in this sort of constant state of separation anxiety, right? So when we have that orientation to the world, which I think is fed by the logic of our economic systems, we easily find justification for violence as a means for keeping what we have, right? Without it, our sense of life and our place within the world is meaningless. One way of looking at it. On the other hand, if I am what I am, then what I am is intrinsic to me as a person, as a human being, and that can't be taken away. I would love to see us find a way to just shift that logic. But this is how the logic of neoliberalism, of our economic systems, has been nurtured through our educational systems, particularly the formal education of the state, and it creates this sickness of separation. Now, as a person who is working in higher education, this last lens I wanted to throw out here I think is really important to me. There has been a very slow, long-term neoliberal takeover of our educational spaces. Not everywhere in the world, but in many. And I like to call this a sort of a neoliberal miseducation that we're experiencing in the world today. So we're seeing the ways in which these sort of market values and market logic is being applied to education. It has had a deeply destabilizing effect through prioritizing those values of individualism I was just talking about, competition, things like production over cooperation. It has pushed out any space for critical thinking, intellectual freedom, and reflection. And so this has been something, like I said, that has been eroding, in particular, spaces of higher education for about a half a century now. And this has opened the door to another problem that I'm deeply concerned about. It's opened the door to the authoritarian takeover of educational spaces. So we're now seeing this convergence of neoliberalism and authoritarianism kind of colliding into a perfect storm in educational spaces. So I guess speaking from my context in the US, there's this rising political culture of anti-intellectualism that's spinning out of this. So people are working to actively discredit the rigorous scientific work of academics and the critical analysis of the academic community. And these actions, I think, pose a really existential threat to the future of higher education in particular, but all education for that matter. Right? We're devaluing it as a space for open, authentic inquiry, for critical reflective thinking, and moral and ethical development. That's a crisis. So when we see this too, to bring back that lens of militarism here, with the convergence of neoliberalism and authoritarianism, things like intellectual activity, they only remain valuable if they generate revenue or they have military use. Right? This is a problem I'm really concerned about. So this is a reality I think that we're now living in. Again, critical thinking is seen as unproductive, it's seen as unpatriotic, it's seen as harmful to the state, and it justifies the criminalization of intellectuals. Right. So we zoom out from this educational space, we can see how discrediting the intellectuals assures that the actual experts, the people with scientific knowledge of issues, institutions, systems, and structures of the world are excluded from decision-making spaces, right? Particularly in the mechanisms of government and of society. And this is an intentional process, right? And all of this undermines the possibilities of promoting peace. And there's more layers to this that we could unpack, but this interdependence between these things, between neoliberalism, authoritarianism, it's led to the erosion of civic participation,
It's led to the erosion of freedom of expression. It's fostered media censorship around the world. It's led to a dramatic decrease in the quality of elections in countries around the world. There is a really scary rise in autocratic regimes happening. So research that's being conducted for the last several decades by the organization Varieties in Democracy Institute found that 74% of the world's population is living in autocracies in the present moment in 2026. That's 6 billion people around the world living under autocracies. And only 7% of the world's population live in liberal democracies. That's a troubling trend, all right? So we have disinformation, polarization, autocratization, they're reinforcing each other. This leads to domestic instability, right? And impedes the much needed transnational cooperation that we need to be working with to address the global threats that define the polycrisis, right? So we have this separation sickness, right? So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, put out their clock every year. Right now we're sitting at 85 seconds to midnight. So these are some things I haven't even addressed that are part of the polycrisis, right? The proliferation of nuclear weapons, climate change, anthropomorphism, disruptive technologies like AI, sorry, translation, right? Combined with the thinking at the heart of this culture of separation, this is a problem. Now, all of us, I think, and this is where I want to shift towards, hopefully, the therapy. All of us, I think, often feel like we're on a sinking ship. All right, we're waiting for a lifeboat to come along and rescue us, but it's not coming. So the vastness of this war system, the vastness of this thinking is overwhelming. It results in fear. It results in resignation, hopelessness, and worst of all, inaction. So what do we do about it? I have some thoughts, as you can imagine. I bet we all do. So let's move to the therapy. How do we learn to live together? And I want to make a bridge to some ideas here by sharing a story about Betty Reardon, who Ingeborg mentioned a minute ago. So for those of you who don't know her, she was a tour de force in the field of peace education and also in the work of gender justice. And she left us 3 years ago in 2023. But a year before her passing in 2022, through our publishing imprint called Peace Knowledge Press, we reissued her seminal early book from the 1980s called Comprehensive Peace Education. We thought we needed to bring that back. And we celebrated this reprinting of her book with a month-long celebration. We hosted a virtual book club where we brought people together to discuss how they'd been using her work in different contexts. But the best part about this experience is we had the chance to bring Betty in to talk about her reflections on the past, present, and future of the field that we're a part of. So she was pretty retrospective, quite candid in what she shared with us. And she was focused on our failures, which was a bit heartbreaking. In particular, she was worried about why we hadn't had greater success, right? Why we hadn't had greater success towards things like nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament, a project she'd been working on her entire life, like many of you in the room, right? So this, like, why haven't we got the results that we thought we would get? All right, this is a half century of work. And I think she was trying to understand it. And I think in the end, she sort of capitulated. She suggested we must have failed in our teaching. We must have failed in the way we were conceptualizing these ideas. We must have failed in the way we were disseminating the learning, developing the teaching, writing, doing the education for peace. So it was really quite heartbreaking to hear her say this. Now, I think it's important for us to reflect on our failures. We all have room to grow. But later on, we had a chance to sit down and talk together in private. And she was kind enough to entertain my thoughts, as she always was. I think, to me, a great educator is one that listens and learns from their students. And I offered maybe just a slightly more hopeful observation. I think one of the things that we were really good at is developing a consciousness of the problem, right? We are really good at analyzing and cognizing the deficits of the system that we're a part of. But that knowledge alone may not be enough to compel people to action. There's things that are holding us back, right? For example, again, the knowledge of the threat of nuclear annihilation, of ecological collapse, it fosters a sense of existential anxiety, right? And then the fear that that instills is not a really creative producer for us, right? It instills a great sense of inhibition towards hope and action. But there's more than fear going on here, more than simple existential anxiety. I'd like to quote scholar Rita Verma, who wrote a wonderful book on these issues. She says, acquiring peace knowledge rarely results in peace activism due to apathy, privilege, and most importantly, the normalization of violence. Right? It's all around us. It's all encompassing. But I think it goes beyond that. Furthermore, just living in a world where all these converging polycrises are happening, it produces trauma. It's really traumatizing, right? Trauma is not only the product of direct experience of fighting and violence, it's something that we experience indirectly through structures and collective experiences. It gets passed down through generations. Living under systems of structural violence and oppression produces trauma, all right? And trauma, and I think this is an area where peace education still needs to think a little bit more, is something that gets embodied in us. It's not just something that we have in our head, right? Traumatic experiences result in the sort of circumnavigation of our cognitive, our reflective, our higher brain functions. When we experience trauma, we end up drawing more directly from our lower brain, our amygdala, and that registers fear response. That fear response then triggers that flight or fight response, right? And then we end up producing these victim-aggressor cycles of violence. So in essence, as I understand this, when we become traumatized, we become a bit disconnected from our rational brain. And our ability to learn, our ability to be self-reflective, our ability to consider another's perspective or another group's point of view, it becomes challenged, it becomes impaired. That's a huge impediment for our ability to work for peace. So I could spend more time kind of doing this prognosis here and to explore a range of answers to Betty's questions about why we failed in this task. But I think there's an area of hope here. One dimension of the work that we can do that I think has the potential for transformation is the pedagogical. All right? Cognition and consciousness of the problem, it's a good starting point. It's a good vision. It offers some aspiration for us. But this alone is not enough. So learning to live together requires more than just knowing. It requires doing. It requires being. Right? It's a personal task and a political task. So nurturing this relationship between the personal and the political, to me, that's at the heart of learning for human agency. So this is what I want to think about. I think peace education is about this. It's a political education. It is definitely learning for human agency, is learning to prepare people to apply their knowledge to the world. So human agency for me, as I understand it and I think about it and I've been trying to interpret it as an educator, exists at these intersections of the personal and the political, which are two vital dimensions of Betty Reardon's comprehensive approach to peace education. And so this is from the book I was mentioning before. She says that the purpose of learning as peace education seeks to cultivate it is transformative. It's drawing from within learners' capacities to be able to envision and affect change and helping them develop the capacity to transform that existing system. So she saw this inward and this outward dimension to peace education. It's not just an internal process. It's not just an individual process. It's a social process. All right? Of course, there's much more to it than that. So I think I could unpack this a little bit, but I know I'm going to get a little bit tight on time. So I want to move to one other final dimension. I think a big part of learning to live together is focusing on the future. All right. So the relationship of the learner to time is something that we need to think a lot about. An education for learning to live together should provide, in my mind, unlimited opportunities for students to be able to kind of critically question the past, the present that they're living in, and the future that they want to move towards. So we think about critical reflection on the past. We do some of this in our work. It's sort of a normal kind of process of education. We engage in critique of systems and structures and institutions of power. That's really important. But another part of this is bringing in the self-reflective component, right? We also want to kind of challenge our own epistemologies, our own assumptions about the world and our place within it. We want to ask those questions, why do I hold the assumptions I have about the world to be true? Where do they come from? What establishes that way of seeing and thinking for me? Where do my beliefs originate from? And then we move, from the past, we start to move into the present. So we start to engage in and facilitate students' reflection on their experience in the present world that they're living in. This supports some of their affective and their intuitive awareness that they need to develop. How do I feel about what I'm experiencing in the world today? Right? We spend a lot of time in educational spaces engaging in analytic ways of knowing, and they become very much privileged over affective, emotional, intuitive, embodied, right, and other imaginative and creative ways of knowing and experiencing the world. So these modes of thinking aren't reflected in our spaces of learning, in my experience. And I think a result of that is that our learning often feels incomplete. So in education, how we feel is often invalidated, right? So our intuitions, when something just doesn't quite feel right about what we're learning, what we're being taught, that's not considered a valued form of knowledge. There's no space to unpack that and understand that. We need to provide those opportunities for learners to be able to do that. We also need to think about how we support learners' relationship to the future. And to me, this is the most important part of our work in peace, all right? If we want to have and foster human agency, we need to think about the future. So this requires us to use practices that engage in more imaginative ways of thinking and knowing, ruminative ways, regenerative ways, engaging in contemplative reflection, right? So sociologist Elise Boulding reminded us we can't work for a world we can't imagine. We know from educational psychology that humans start to construct reality in their minds before they act on it externally. So how we think about the future also shapes the actions that we take in the present. And so most of us living under this polycrisis are just, in that deep spiral of negativity and our assumptions about the future, the self-fulfilling prophecy that the doom is going to come, the present moment that we're in, the trajectory that we're going, it's going to end in catastrophe. We can't see a better world. It's really hard. So we have to open ourselves up in some creative ways to thinking about the preferred world we want to move into, right? We need to step away from maybe, at least temporarily, rational thought, embrace those intuitive ways, those effective ways of knowing and thinking and being. And so ultimately, for me, transformative human agency is dependent upon our ability to be able to envision preferred worlds and realities. And we also need to be able to believe that a new world is even possible. And I think that's a real struggle for many of us. All right. So I want to maybe wrap up, and I have many more thoughts to share with one more story. I think this framework, which maybe I haven't fully developed for you for lack of time, of learning to live together, is not meant to be a prescription, a simple therapy to the polycrisis. It's not enough. But it does demand that education needs to find ways to confront and disrupt the status quo. But we have a choice in how we choose to do that, how we approach that challenge, that undertaking. So another thing that Betty Reardon and I often discussed is we needed to figure out ways to engage in politics in a different way. And so we came up with this idea that we need to find out ways to engage in politics in what we described as a learning mode, rather than an adversarial mode, right? And so that kind of traditional mode of politics that we engage in fosters separation, it creates winners and losers, it kind of just gets us stuck in a place of oppositional resistance rather than transformative resistance. I hold the belief that we'd be better off approaching the task of transforming institutions, structures, and policies by showing up as educators and not politicians. There are some exceptional politicians that do that, all right? What I've discovered in the work that I've done for the last 15 years in particular is that institutions learn in the same ways that humans do, for the most part. That they're more likely to transform and change when the learning is pulled out of them, when it's elicited from within, rather than imposed from above. And this is how I try to approach my work in the space of the Global Campaign and the International Institute, right? So when I think about this challenge, about how and why should we engage in politics in a learning mode, I'm reminded an experience that I had about 20 years ago, working with a network of peace educators in Colombia. So this network invited me to meet with a group of representatives from the Ministry of Education in the country. And this is well before the peace accords and where they're at this stage now. And we wanted to discuss the role of peace education in contributing to ending the conflict and healing the country. But they weren't quite ready to have that conversation. So this was very much a political encounter. We had an objective we wanted to achieve, a vision we wanted to share. But my colleagues, rather than showing up and making demands and putting forward some sort of policy that they wanted to see, they showed up as facilitators. They showed up as teachers, as educators first. And it was really wild, I have to tell you. They walked into the room, and before they even started talking, they started playing games with the ministry officials, right? They had them coloring mandalas together collectively on the table. So they had teachers sitting together with ministry officials. They engaged them in a trust walk. This was not your typical political encounter. At the same time, it was probably the most politically efficacious encounter I've ever witnessed. All right? So they truly got to the heart of what really mattered by approaching the task, not as politicians, but as educators, as teachers, to help them to see, feel, and be as they were trying to do with their students. So I hold this sort of radical view in the end of the day, the educators, and I think we all are. Remember, I said at the beginning that when I talk about education, I'm not just talking about education that takes place in schools and universities. I'm talking about people who are engaged in the process of facilitating learning for change. So if you're an activist, you're an educator. If you're a peace builder, you're an educator, right? If you're a politician, you're an educator. But I hold this view that we as educators are the key link in that sort of chain of social, relational, and political change, right? Learning to live together, learning to engage in politics together, learning to transform our world together. This is what educators do, and this is how we do it. So thank you for listening to me quote cursed crap. I appreciate your attention, and thank you very much. Coincidentally, look, I'm really excited to say that this caricature, which was drawn 20 years ago, on my shirt, it says NPA, so I feel like I'm an honorary member of the Nordic Peace Alliance. But this stands for National Peace Academy. But anyhow, thank you very much.
Thank you.